everyone. So for those who might not know, we are the Eudaimonia Institute. Sometimes we organize lectures like this. Last year we had the entire lecture series. This year we do not, but sometimes we have this one-off special lectures. So if any of you are interested in specific topic, scholar, you may contact and we may be able to bring some funding to it. And today it brings me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Aviezer Tucker, who represents the University of Harvard, but at least as importantly is the director of the Center for Philosophy of Historiography at the University of Ostrava. So that's a newly founded center, and I'm sure what will follow from there. Just a few words about Avi, who's been active a long time in the field of philosophy of history and historiography, and he has also other interests, or more widely interested in epistemology and philosophy of science. And I think in Avi's thinking, philosophy of historiography is a subfield of philosophy of science. And he has also interested in political philosophy, and has most recent book is intriguingly entitled Democracy Against Liberalism. And I took a couple of books from my bookshelf. So this is Our Knowledge of the Past, the Philosophy of Historiography from the 1990s. What is the exact year now?
2004.
2004. It's even more recent. Anyway, this is an excellent book, and one of the few books of general characterizations of what philosophy of historiography is. There aren't many around, and of course it has now its own approach too. So I think I have read it carefully, many people have read it carefully, cited one. Another that I took from my bookshelf is a companion to the philosophy of history and historiography. So it's edited by Avi, and as far as I know, it's the first and the only collection of philosophy of history and historiography. And importantly, for me and for many, Avi introduces their distinction between philosophy of history and philosophy of historiography. Today, we are concerned with philosophy of historiography as a subfield of philosophy of science, interested in the concepts and assumptions and methodologies, explanations of the historical discipline, study of the past. But I let Avi to describe and tell more about all those matters. So without further ado, it's indeed a great pleasure to introduce you to, give the floor to you. You'll be talking about an origins and origination.
Thank you. I suppose we can also add another forthcoming book, handbook to the philosophy of the historical sciences, or handbook to the philosophy of big history, that will come out with Bloomsbury probably next year. I'm co-editing it with my Ostrava colleague David Chernin, and that will be again a first in its kind, first collection of philosophical essays on history, philosophy of history in the grand sense of the word, from the Big Bang to this lecture. Why talk about origin and origination as part of a philosophical discourse, philosophy of science, or rather philosophy of the historical sciences? Let's make some, what I hope we would agree on, are trivial assumptions. The past, by definition, is unobservable, with the exception of astronomy or cosmology, where we can indeed see how the universe looked at the time when the light signals were sent to Earth, or the other waves were sent to Earth. The past cannot be known a priori. The past is not just a matter of constructed fiction. And therefore, if it's not observable, if it's not a priori, if it's not fiction, it is probable. We infer propositions about the past from evidence in the present. The historian is always in the position of this fellow behind me who runs after the train, if the train is the past, representing the past after the train has left the station. If so, the historical sciences are primarily inferred from information preserving evidence in the present. And they generate a probable historical inferences of the origins of the evidence in the present. And that leads us to an obvious question. What are origins? As obvious as this question is, oddly enough, as far as I know, there are no philosophical discussions of what origins are in general. There are plenty of philosophical discussions, perhaps too much, of causation. And the same thing is true also for philosophy of historiography. There are debates, discussions of causation in historiography. There's no discussion of where we would come to know about causation from, and these are inferences of origins. It seems to me that the glare, the focus of the philosophical discussion on causation was so bright that it obscured objects that were close to causation but not identical with it, such concepts such as origin, origination, originary sciences. I'm using these words even though they're part of the English language. Not too many people are using it because origination is comparable to causation, originary is comparable to causal. So I'm going to use these expressions as I go along. Many, and it's undeniable, many of the great achievements of science in the last 200 years were the discoveries of origins. And just to have an intuitive understanding of what origins are, let's look at a few examples of that. So most obvious one is Charles Darwin's inference of the origins of species. If you just think about it, it would sound a bit awkward to say Darwin discovered the causes of species. It's a bit strange. Origins. This is the this is the original insight where he writes in his diary, I think, and then he draws a phylogenetic tree. This is the actual phylogenetic tree in the origins of species. What you can see is that he makes a number of false assumptions here, because you see that these are all equidistant. This is time per species. So the assumption is that there's a constant rate of evolution of species, which is of course false. But that's the first tree first phylogenetic tree that Darwin drew. But Darwin is the most obvious case for inferences of origins in science, but he's far from being the only one. This is the contemporary view of the origin of life, which as you can see, it's very different from Darwin. It's not just that you can see that the length of each branch is different. So sometimes evolution moves very quickly, other times it moves very slowly. But more interestingly is the cases of horizontal gene transfer. That is, somehow genes from here ended up all the way here. And I will be back to horizontal gene transfer later, because it exemplifies some interesting philosophical points I want to make. But you can see here how different it is from Darwin, because in Darwin, each branch of the tree of life was separate. There was no transfer of information from one to another. And actually, as we know today, there were this transfer. Another interesting question about origins that we will not touch on today, but it is the subject of fascinating debate in biology, and hopefully one day we will have some progress, is about the origins of life itself. Did life originate once? Did it originate multiple times? Did it originate on this planet? Did it originate on another planet? How probable is the origin of life? And so on and so forth. These are all things that at this stage are underdetermined. The origin of the universe is, of course, the Big Bang. And again, what you have is a kind of a tree. It starts here, and then the universe evolves. We infer the knowledge of the Big Bang from background radiation, among other messages or causal mechanisms that scientists project on the past. But at the basis of it is an inference from waves that we receive in the present that were sent at the time of the Big Bang. In geology, the origin of the current distribution of continents is the ancient continent of Pangea. Here, they just show it to you nicely. Brazil was stuck there in Western Africa, United States connected to Northwestern Africa, and so on and so forth, which explains the present distribution of rocks and rock sediments around the globe. You can also show that I don't have a tree-like diagram here, but you can definitely have a tree that would, let's say, put Brazil on one side and Western Africa on the other, as spreading from the ancient continent. Languages probably are the first originary science. That's already late 18th century. This is obviously an older tree that shows how language families evolved from different origins. This is a more modern way of putting it without making historical assumptions, simply by measuring similarities between languages and then grouping them together in families according to how similar they are, without making an assumption about what came first and what came later. You can have the same sort of non-temporal diagram in phylogeny in biology as well. Documents, the origins of documents, pretty much the documentary hypothesis evolved pretty much at the same time, and sometimes by the same people who also evolved the hypothesis about common origins of languages. Here the idea is to see what are the similarities between various texts. These are the texts of the Pentateuch. These are the texts of the New Testament, of the Synoptic Gospels. Again, it shows you the similarities between them, and then there's the inference of where the common origins came from and how they are connected to with various trees, until you get the composite texts that we know today as the Old and New Testaments. So, for many people, when I show all these trees, they say, okay, so there's this surface similarity, but is there also philosophical commonality to all these fields? Are they using the same methodology? When they say origin, do they mean the same thing? How is that related to causation, and so on and so forth? My argument is that all origins are sources of information. They send a signal in time. Most signals get lost very quickly. They deteriorate due to entropy, due to equivocation. Some signals make it to the present. They go through transmission. During transmission, the signals are in latency. That is, the signals are there, but they're not expressed. The signal reaches receivers. The information is preserved. And then the historical scientists decode that information to infer the origins. So the era of time goes from the information that is sent by the origin to the receivers in the present. The era of inference goes backward, from the decoding of the information in the present to the past. And the information signals, of course, are different, but I will try to show that even though the media are different, the actual form of inference can be shown using tools of philosophy of science to actually do pretty much the same thing. That is, we started with Darwin. The signals from the history of life are transmitted either through genetic material, through DNA that preserves the signals about what happened in the past, or through fossils, different media, but fossils that preserve information about the shape of the animals, about their bones and so on, or through a combination of these two. That's the modern development, the ability to infer some DNA from some fossilized bones. The inner ear bone is actually the best for inferring DNA. In physics or cosmology, the Big Bang sent waves, background radiation to the present. It traveled over 13.7 billion years. Scientists in the present decode those messages and they infer the origin of the universe. The similarities between languages, different languages preserve similar basic vocabulary. The most important words are the ones that denote immediate family members, the first three numbers, body parts, names of fauna and flora, and the grammatical structure, because they change more slowly than other parts of language. And from that, the first significant inference was of the common origin of Sanskrit and ancient Greek that created the family of the Indo-European languages, but then of course there are other language families. You compare the text of the New Testament, of the Synoptic Testament, which is there are some similarities, there are some differences. The similarities are highly unlikely to be coincidental. There must be some kind of a common origin. The going inference is that probably originally there were two texts, one of the sayings of Jesus, possibly in Aramaic rather than in Greek. Jesus, of course, did not know Greek. And the other tells stories about Jesus's life. And the later text used those two texts to create the Gospels that we have today. What's the alternative? What's the alternative to regarding the historical sciences as sciences that infer origins? There are three alternatives. I would argue that none of them is very plausible. Positivism argued that historiography is simply an applied science. It applies the social sciences or what was known as laws of human nature, what we would call today psychology, to cover historiographic causes and effects. Somehow science, the historical sciences are an applied science. They take their laws or the theories from somewhere else, and then they somehow plug in facts and they get an explanation. Wrong on two kinds. Wrong both because there are no given historical facts that historians can simply plug into some sort of a pre-existing pattern or theory. Everything we know about historiography, about history, must be inferred, and it has to be inferred in a certain way. And I would argue what is inferred are origins, which are propositions that describe events. Nothing is given. And as I will also argue a bit later, historiography is not an applied science because with the best sociology and the best psychology, you could still not simply apply it to history. It doesn't work that way. Another option is humanism. Historiography understands the past through the minds of the people who did history and their actions. Historiography is then describing the causes of mental actions or mental causes of actions. That's a very limited concept. Of course, it is only applied to human beings. It is not applied to natural history, to history of text, to the history of languages, all the things that I described earlier. And it limits the scope of historiography to the consciousness of past agents. I would argue that much of historiography deals with events that were not conscious, that people did not make decision. They acted, but they didn't necessarily understand why they were doing what they were doing, because the processes were long and they couldn't understand, and the people who acted in them could not understand them. For example, the Industrial Revolution, the Renaissance, the environmental history of Europe, all these things, the sort of thing that Brodel worked on. All these things are very slow. People participate in them and do not understand the nature of the historical concept, and they don't necessarily take action on the basis of beliefs and motives the way that theory of action would analyze their activities. They act more in an unconscious, natural, uncontemplative way, and sometimes they don't even act. They just receive the actions of other people or receive the result of changes that happen in nature, environmental changes that nobody brought about, or the people who brought them about did not realize they were bringing it about. Finally, there's narrativism, the argument that historiography is just a story that connects causes with effects. I would argue that it's possible to connect causes and effects without a narrative, but narrative is a very superficial part of the historical sciences. When it appears only in the end, after the research, on the basis of the research. It sometimes generates new knowledge when you put several influences together, but it is not the center of the philosophy of the historical activity, which is the inference of origins. In order for me to elaborate on the meaning of origin in a philosophical discussion, I would follow a methodology of distinguishing them from causation, origination from causation. I would argue that origins are distinct of causes, and by showing the differences between them, I will try to establish a realm for the historical sciences, for sciences that discuss causation, that have causes and effects, but at the center of their activity is the inference of origins. And when they discuss the inferences of origins, they infer, coincidentally, secondarily, also inferences of causes and effects. But the inferences of causes and effects are secondary to the inferences of origins, which are quite distinct. A more extreme position than the one I'm trying to put here, that just makes a distinction between, conceptual distinction between origin and effects, can be presented by Dretsky, who introduced really the discussion of information in epistemology. Here he looks very young and handsome and cool with a cigarette. Obviously, this is not something that was taken in this century. And Dretsky said there's no connection between one and the other. And I'm quoting here, one can have full information without causality, and one can have no information with causality. There's every shade of gray between these two extremes. His position, I would say, is quite extreme, but I still want to make a distinction. I want to argue that they are not reducible to each other, even though there can be a significant overlap, especially between origins that supervene on causes, but there are causes that are not origins. So I would argue information cannot be transmitted, it might not be transmitted property in process theory of causation, because there is no preservation of information through causation, not necessarily. It can happen, but it doesn't have to happen. There is some theories of causation, and I will, rather than defend any particular theory of causation to distinguish it from a theory of origination, I will just go through all the theories of causation, all the main theories of causation. What I would argue is that irrespective of your theory of causation, it is distinct of origination, without taking sides. So what I'm developing is a series of disjuncts. Causation is either this, and then it's distinct from origins, or it's like that, and it's distinct from origins, and so on and so forth. One basic theory of causation is process theory. It's saying that causes and effects are part of the same process. There's some sort of a property that is transmitted from the causes to the effects structurally, and that's how we can know that causes are connected with effects rather than just one thing happening after another without a causal link between them. I argue, and I think it's fairly obvious, that some causes simply do not transmit information. An obvious example, two obvious examples, one that's example that Dretsky brings is of the perfect crime. What makes the crime perfect? The criminal caused the crime to happen, but the criminal did not transmit any information about themselves to the effect of their criminal cause. That is, John Smith murdered somebody, but they left no evidence, no trace, no information that can trace back, the detective can trace back to the crime. That's a perfect crime. No information possible to know who committed the crime, and therefore nobody can be punished. The Big Bang is a kind of cosmic perfect crime. The Big Bang is the origin of the universe, but since the Big Bang emerged from a singularity and information cannot be transmitted through a singularity, it has no cause that can be known. It may have had a cause, but there's no way that we can know what that cause was. So the Big Bang had no origin. There are several theories of causation and several theories that some of them also suggest how they could prove or disprove the theory about the cause of the Big Bang. I will leave that aside. What we know today is that it emerged out of singularity. If it did not emerge out of a singularity, it may have an origin. We can know what is the origin of the Big Bang. But as long as we assume that the Big Bang emerged out of singularity, it may have had a cause, but it may not have had an origin. Informational similarities, of course, are not sufficient for inferring causation because they may be coincidental. When you have two students that have similar phrases in their exams, it doesn't mean that one copied the other. They may have, but it's not sufficient. So information is not sufficient. Information similarity is not sufficient for inferring a common origin or a common causation. I would argue, though, that origination may supervene on causation. It has different properties, but it supervenes on causation. When information is transmitted, there is some kind of a causal mechanism going on, but sometimes we don't know, and sometimes we don't even need to know what was the causal mechanism. It doesn't matter. For example, when we talk about histories of ideas, it's an obvious fact that one of the origins or major origin of Immanuel Kant's philosophy was Hume's philosophy. That's not a terribly controversial statement. Obviously, Immanuel Kant received information from David Hume. What was the exact causal chain that connected David Hume with Immanuel Kant? Well, Hume published a book, and probably, I don't know if Immanuel Kant knew English, whether he read the translation to German or whether he read the original and which edition and which copy. I don't know, but there may be a way of finding out, but who cares really? It doesn't matter. What we're interested when we do history of ideas or intellectual history is on the level of information transmission. It's what is the origin of somebody's thought, philosophy, art, and so on. The exact causal chain doesn't matter. And I would argue that the historical sciences typically operate on the level of information transmission and origin inferences rather than looking for the causal mechanism on which the information transmission may supervene. Another way of another paradigmatic example for distinguishing causation from origination. When all origins are also causes, but not all causes are origins. And that's the distinction between genealogy and genetic ancestry. So genealogy is causal. Each one of us had two parents who caused us. They had two parents that caused them, and so on and so forth. It evolves geometrically. But if you look at genetic ancestry, that is, what section of our DNA was received from one of our ancestors, those two trees are not identical. Because even though our DNA is the DNA of our parents plus whatever mutation we accumulated, once you go back 20 generations genealogically, most of your genealogical ancestors did not transmit genetic information that you received. This was lost on the way. That's because slices of DNA, slices of genome are not They do not multiply geometrically. There's only a limited number of slices that each generation can move to the next generation. So in fact, large majority of our genealogical ancestors, once you go back enough, let's say 20 generations, did not transmit any information to us. They were not our origins. They were our causes. They married, they had children, they fed their children, those children married and fed their children and so on to make our existence possible, but they did not transmit information. They were not our origins. There's no piece of our DNA came from them. So they were causes, they were not origins. Genetic ancestry is only of origins. Some origins can be inferred, and now we move to the epistemic level, which is much more interesting for me. Some origin can be inferred without knowing the underlying mechanisms or causes. Two obvious examples, one from history and one from the present. Charles Darwin, as everybody knows, knew nothing about genetics. That only was invented much later by Georg Mendel in Brno, and Mendel himself was not very influential. The synthesis of genetics and evolutionary biology is only early 20th century. So Charles Darwin he knew what were the origins of species. He inferred the origin of species without knowing anything about a mechanism that would facilitate, enable, transmit that information. He didn't know what was the causal mechanism. The only principle that he had was that like begets like, that horses tend to beget horses and elephants tend to beget elephants and not the other way around. That's the only thing he had. So obviously mechanisms are not necessary for causation epistemically, even though Darwin probably knew there was some kind of mechanism, but he didn't know which. And that's one criticism of mechanical theories of causation that is much stronger when we talk about origination. Origination really does not need a mechanism. Another example is contemporary. I mentioned earlier horizontal gene transfer, when species that are very distant in the history of life or genealogically can be shown to have transmitted DNA information to each other. That is, if you do a scan of a human genome and you find a piece of the genome that really comes from an insect, for example, and we have that in our genome. Obviously, the inference of the origin is obvious because that section of the DNA does not belong there, does not come, it is not from the tree that belongs to mammals. It's not something that we got from one of our direct ancestors. And it's possible to show this gap. But what mechanism, in the case of eukaryotes, what mechanism transmitted that piece of DNA from the origin, in this case, let's say an insect, to the receiver, in this case, a human genome, is usually unknown. There are all kinds of theories, could be through viruses, who knows? Scientists don't really know. And in order to substantiate that there was a horizontal gene transfer, that we got this piece of the genome from another animal, you don't need to know the mechanism. It's just simply so implausible that spontaneously our genome would mutate to have a piece of genome that is usually found among insects, that we would know somehow it came from the insect, not from a mutation. We know the origin, we don't know what is the mechanism. Another example from human or environmental history, biological history, is of the Polynesian potatoes. When Captain Cook arrived in Polynesia, he discovered that the Polynesian natives were growing potatoes. And to make it even more interesting, the Polynesian word for potato, if I remember correctly, it's kumala, is very similar to the word in Proto-Andean languages for potato, which is something like camara or something like that. At any rate, those similarities cannot be coincidental. The obvious conclusion is that the Polynesian got the potatoes from the Andes region, and somehow they were also in contact with natives of South America who taught them the word for potato. The transmission happened at the same time. That origin is obvious. How plausible is it that the potato would somehow magically emerge in Polynesia? What we don't know is the mechanism. So what you can see here is a possible mechanism. How they could have transmitted it with boats, either boats that were going from South America to Polynesia, or boats that were going from Polynesia to South America. Another possibility is, you see, that there can be even something more bizarre, that they somehow ended up in the Philippines first and then came from, who knows? Those mechanisms are entirely unknown. But the interesting thing is that in order to infer the origins, we don't need to know the mechanism. It supervenes. We know there was some kind of mechanism. It was no miracle. But what the mechanism was is unknown. And what I would argue, more importantly, it doesn't have to be known. It doesn't matter. So in general, we can distinguish causal processes from information transmission processes that transmit information that is then preserved and then is useful for inferring origins. We can see in the case of the inference of the origins of texts, the process, obviously the pre-modern, before the invention of printing, the process of transmitting text was copying them. That was, one text was copied into another and transmitted the text. One text caused the next text. But how do we know which text was copied from who? The information preserving part of text that allow us to infer origins are errors, because it's highly unlikely that two texts would have the same error coincidentally, or even better, the same group of errors, the same mistakes in copying, unless they were copying a mistake that was made earlier, and that means that they were copied from the same now lost old text. And then you can compare that already hypothetical text with either other hypothetical text, see how they are connected, and then you can construct this kind of tree. The important thing is that texts do not preserve information to the same degree. The errors preserve information much better than just the normal types of text. Languages, one language causes the next language, but in order to infer the trees of languages, the family trees of the various languages, we're looking for parts of language that change more slowly than other parts of language. As I mentioned already, and that was a discovery that was made already in the late 18th century in Berlin, among other places, is that basic vocabulary of flora, fauna, immediate body parts, immediate family members, and grammar and syntax, they change more slowly than other parts of language. And if you just think, play with it a little bit with languages that you know, this could have been known for thousands of years. People could have noticed that when they were, if they were comparing languages that they knew. The history of life is, of course, a causal process, but what Darwin was doing, he was looking for what he called rudiments, or what we would call today homologies. That is, properties of species, characteristics of species that do not convey a particular evolutionary advantage nor disadvantage. Because if you have a trait that conveys reproductive advantage, it will reproduce very quickly in a population. If you have a trait that creates a disadvantage, it will disappear very quickly from a population. The traits that remain the same through many, many generations are those traits that do not give us or an animal particular advantage or disadvantage. For example, 5 digits, right? Could have worked just as well with 6. Probably could have worked just as well with 4. Why do all mammals have 5? Because it did not convey particular advantage or disadvantage. Fingers convey an advantage. Having no fingers creates a big disadvantage. But 5 rather than 4 or 6 or 7, that's just because we have a common ancestor who had 5 digits. No other reason. And that's why it's preserved, and that can create a nice family. Just very simple trait, just catalog all the animals, the ones that have 5 fingers, 5 digits, and the ones that have a different number, like 3, which is also very common for the same reason. 3 could have worked just as well with 5 or with 7, but 3. The evolution of species is, again, something that is causal. The evolution of the DNA is something that preserves information. That's what modern phylogeny is all based on. We compare the DNAs rather than the traits of the animal, and then we discover that species were related to each other according to the rate of evolution of those parts of the DNA that do not convey particular advantage or disadvantage, and so they just stay there. When we compare fossils, the DNA, the most well-preserved part of the fossil is usually the inner ear bone. The DNA decays most slowly from the inner bone. So today, when you read all these great discoveries about Neanderthals and so on, that's all from the inner ear bone. It does the trick. Society evolves very quickly. So just make yourself a thought experiment. Suppose that you had the perfect sociological analysis of the contemporary Mediterranean. If somebody gives you a perfect analysis of Spain and Italy and Greece and North Africa and so on, would that suffice for you to infer the history of the Roman Empire? No, it wouldn't, because because the evolution of society was so quick that it is not enough to really give you a solid history of the Roman Empire that ruled all these parts 2,000 years ago. What you would need is parts of society that preserve information most reliably, and this would be the testimonies of the ancient texts of historiography, artifacts, archaeological discoveries, and material remains, what archaeology does. These are the parts that preserve information and therefore can be useful to infer origins. In a sense, what the historians or the historical scientists are fighting is entropy. Entropy is our enemy. Entropy destroys information. And what we are looking for is those aspects of things that go through the slowest possible entropy. The faster the entropy, the more useless the evidence is. So if we look at the sources that historians are using, oral traditions decay most quickly. Memories are so notoriously unreliable, especially if they try to transmit information rather than generate information. I'll get back to that in a moment. Social evolution is a bit slower, but as I brought the example from contemporary societies around the Mediterranean, it evolves so quickly you can't really infer anything about the Roman Empire. Linguistic evolution is slower. With languages, you can make inferences for events that happened, for origins that happened thousands of years ago. The Indo-European hypothesis, the oldest Indo-European languages that we have are Sanskrit, Hittite, ancient Greek, but they allow us to make inferences about events that happened thousands of years earlier. DNA can go back millions of years, more than millions of years. Background radiation redshift in cosmology goes back to the beginning of the universe, more than 13 billion years ago. Very slow entropy. So another basic distinction between causes and origins is that origins are exclusively tokens. They happen in a particular space at a particular time. The origin of the universe, the origin of text, the origins of languages, these are all events that happen at a particular place at a particular time. Causes can be tokens as well, can also have particular space and time, but in the theoretical sciences, causes are types. Scientists are not interested in how light bifractures here and now. That's just an example of something much more interesting, which is the type of cause. Light, gravity. These are all causes that are types, that are part of theories. And that's what scientists are usually interested in. On the other hand, tracing information does not require covering regularities in the way that tracing types of causes is necessary. To take the examples that I brought already about inferences of origins when we don't know the underlying causal mechanism, like the transfer of the horizontal transfer of genes, the transfer of the potato from South America to Polynesia. We are certain about that inference. We know that the Polynesian potato could have only come from South America. We can know that a part of the genome, the human genome, had an insect origin. And then it's not just that we don't know the cause, we don't need to know a covering law, we don't need to know the type of cause that was involved, the theory that connects one to the other. This is all redundant, even if it's possible to know. On the other hand, causes arguably, and causes when we discuss causes as types, part of theories, they're always part of a larger theory. And there is not a covering law, there is a covering theory that somehow underlies the causal inferences of types in theories. There are other causes that can be part of singular causes, and there was, of course, a lot of debates about that in philosophy of historiography 50 years ago. But the important thing to distinguish is that the inferences of origins definitely do not require any sort of theory. Inferences of causes, if you infer types, you need a theory there. Another example, intellectual traditions. When you have one tradition connected to another, you can prove that without knowing any covering law, without having any theory. To take an example from linguistic expressions, if you know the expression when pigs fly, to say that something is impossible. Obviously, different languages will have some kind of expression to say it's impossible, right? But why pigs fly when there are millions of ways of saying that something is impossible? Well, pigs fly appeared for the first time in English in the 17th century, and then it became popularized by Alice in Wonderland. So if you read a text that refers to something as being impossible from colonial India, let's say, what you know is there's some kind of chain that connects this information with Alice in Wonderland. Maybe the author read Alice in Wonderland, maybe he read somebody who read Alice in Wonderland. There was this kind of transmission of information. Causal laws, that's just irrelevant. You can prove the transmission of information, you can prove the origin without any reference to a causal mechanism or to a covering law model. The invention of the devil can be traced to the interaction between Judaism and the Persian religion. In the Bible, there was no devil. The original Bible, there was no devil. There were many gods, and then it was edited by monotheists who had only one God. The devil happens much later. The devil enters because the Jews were exiled in first Babylonia, then Persia. There they got in touch with the Zoroastrian religion that had two gods, and the devil was imported from there. Causal mechanism, who cares? I don't know what are the laws that govern the invention of the devil, but that's where it came from. So as I argued, information preservation infers origin without mechanisms that connect the origins with the receivers. And therefore, another theory of causation, contiguity, that says causes and effect are connected by some kind of space-time worms, is superfluous. There may be a space-time worm that connects origins with receivers, probably there is, but it supervenes, the inference of origin supervenes on the existence of that space-time worm, and we don't need to know it. Epistemically, I mean, metaphysically, there may be this kind of space-time worm, but epistemically, we do not need to know that space-time worm, because it's possible to infer an origin without knowing any kind of this kind of sort of contiguous process. Actually, it's very plausible that we will not discover this space-time worm because of the existence of latency. To transmit information between the origin, the source, and the receiver, there has to be a period of latency, period when the information exists, but it is not expressed. And that would be a break in the space-time worm, at least in an epistemic sense. Another theory of causation, of course, is counterfactual theory of causation, perhaps the most sophisticated theory of causation. Origination avoids many of the problems that were associated with counterfactual theories of causation. In fact, if we think about some of the major counterexamples to counterfactual theories of causation as applying to counterfactual theories of origination, the problems disappear. The counterexamples are no longer counterexamples. For example, what happens when we describe a cause as omission? Why did the patient die? Because the doctor did not administer a certain medicine, for example. If you try to give it a counterfactual interpretation, you get into trouble, and I don't need to get into all of that. In the case of origination, when we talk about sources of information, there is no problem. Omission can transmit information in a context. So, for example, if I open the daily newspaper and there's nothing there about a major asteroid hitting planet Earth, it's an omission. But it transmits information. It didn't happen. Because the rules that govern what goes into a newspaper, what is published in the newspaper, and what is not, would say if there's a major event that caused the death of many people, it will be reported in the newspaper. If it's not reported in the newspaper, it wasn't there. Or as the saying goes, no news, omission of news, good news. Means no catastrophe has happened. Transitivity is a problem for counterfactual. That is, if event A caused event B caused event C, what is the relationship between event A and event C? When we talk about transmission of information, it's very simple. What was the reliability of the transmission from A to B? That is, how much of the information that originated in A reached B? Let's say 50%. What percentage of that information was transmitted to event C, to source C? Let's say another 50%. So A is the origin of C, 25%. Easy quantitative account, no problem at all. You can grade also which origins are more important than other origins by the same method. So you can say that Sartre starts his Être et néant with a quotation from David Hume. So was David Hume an origin of Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy? Yes, but a very tiny origin, because Sartre does not really preserve a lot of information about David Hume. Martin Heidegger was a much more important source, a much more important origin for Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy if we write an intellectual history, because Sartre preserves much more information from Heidegger's philosophy than from David Hume's philosophy. There's a debate whether delayers and preventers, that is, there's a cause that causes an effect, then something delays the effect, or something prevents it, or something preempts it. Big problem for counterfactual theories of causation, then they become elaborate and sophisticated or self-contradictory. When you talk about origin, no problem. Origin transmits information. If it's delayed or prevented, that's not an origin, it's something else. Overdetermination, a huge problem for counterfactual theories of causation. What if you have a number of people murdered somebody and each one of their actions was redundant? Let's say if you look at Julius Caesar, the assassination of Julius Caesar, who caused the death of Julius Caesar? There are all these senators with their knives. Well, each one of them was redundant because one good cut of the knife would have been enough. So if you have a counterfactual theory of causation, overdetermination may be a problem. But if you look at Caesar's corpse, not as an effect, but as a receiver of information, and if you look at the senators with their knife, not as causes of Caesar's death, which they also were, but as origins of information, then the exact pattern of wounds on Caesar's body is not overdetermined. Had one of them not stabbed Caesar, there would have been one stab fewer than there actually was, if you look at it as a receiver of information. So again, overdetermination is not a big issue. It's a minor issue, especially when the information is very poor. So if you can look, I think it was Philippides who told the Athenians that they won in the Battle of Marathon. So he sort of said, "We won," and then he collapsed, right? Very information poor. Obviously, the next person who ran after him would have given the Athenians exactly the same information. We won. So the knowledge that the Athenians had about the victory in the Battle of Marathon could be said to be overdetermined because it is so information poor. On the other hand, you can try and get out of it, wiggle your way out of it a bit when you talk about different reliabilities, because the reliability of Philippides could have been different from the reliability of the person who just ran after him. So it would have been the same information, perhaps, but with different reliabilities. The example for omission as a cause, as an origin of information, is the famous case from Sherlock Holmes, when the dog did not cry in the night. The fact that the dog did not bark in the night preserved information that whoever killed the horse was familiar to the dog. And within the context of that story, it was only the trainer of the horse that the dog knew. And that's why the dog did not bark. So it's a case of omission, which is an origin of information, with then Sherlock Holmes decoded. So why is this important for historiography? There's a huge debate between Derek Turner and Carol Cleland about the transmission of information from the past to the present. Derek says it's basically, there's a decreasing knowledge of the past, or ceteris paribus, there would be a decreasing knowledge of the past because of entropy. Information decays. We lose information all the time. Some things about the past we will never know. Carol Cleland says, well, actually, it's more like information waves. Same way that you would throw a stone to the pool and waves would move in opposite direction. Any event creates this kind of informational waves. Because the waves move in all directions at the same time, even if some of them are lost, you may be able to trace them much later. My argument is there's nothing general here. They're both right. And we have to look at specific media, and we need to use information theories to be able to discover signals when they are there. But it's perfectly possible that a lot of things, a lot of information is lost pretty much forever. It's very difficult to imagine scientists discovering signals from those events. For example, what was the religion of the cave dwellers who painted those beautiful caves in France? What was the origin of Hitler's obsession with Jews? What were the exact details and discussions when historical agents took action that seems entirely ridiculous? There are things about the past that we will never know. What were the original texts of the pre-Socratics? So, ceteris paribus, and this is a huge distinction between causes and origins. Ceteris paribus, the more information rich are receivers, the more determined are the origins, and vice versa linearly. That's pretty commonsensical. If I have 10 archives about the historical event, I know much more about it. I can determine hypotheses about the origins of those archives than if there's one document left and it's unreliable. That's pretty commonsensical. However, if you assume that causes and effects must be connected by some kind of theory, by some kind of covering law, in fact, the more details we have about the event, the less we are able to confirm the causal relation between cause and effect. For example, why is it so difficult to determine in the social sciences theories about particular evolutions? Because there's just too much about it, too much information. It's too detailed. When it's too detailed, there are not enough cases that can confirm or disconfirm theories. That's why the social sciences have to abstract. They can have theories about revolutions that would apply to hundreds of cases of revolutions. None of them very specific. But they wouldn't be able to have an authoritative, well-confirmed theory about the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, because there's just too much detail, and then it's very difficult to find a theory that can be confirmed about something so detailed. That is one of the foundations for the differences between the historical sciences and theoretical sciences. For example, between historiography, human historiography, and the social sciences, between phylogeny and physiology. The more information there is, the easier it is to determine origins. The more information, the more details there are, the more difficult it is to substantiate theories about those events. But luckily enough, it's possible to confirm causal statements about the past without referring to any covering laws. Why? If you look at the cause and effect sequence as an event that transmits information to the present, it's possible to extract, decode that information, infer a causal link without knowing anything about the laws or theories that connect causes and effects. For example, how do we know that on a certain evening in the First World War, a group of soldiers came under heavy bombardment and they retreated in fear? If you look at it as some sort of applied science, applied psychology, or applied sociology, would have to say something like, human beings try to avoid dangerous situations. So when they encounter a dangerous situation, they become afraid and they do whatever they can to avoid it. Then you plug in what you learned from the past. There was a bombardment. It's a dangerous situation, threatening situation. Soldiers became afraid. Therefore, they ran away and retreated and then regrouped. Very nice. Unfortunately, there are three human reactions to dangerous situation. One is try to avoid it, to run away. The other is to attack back. And the third is to freeze in fear. You just don't do anything. So you run away, you run forward, or you freeze. And these are the only three logical possibilities. Why apply each one of them to this particular situation? Well, because what the historian does is not apply psychology or apply sociology or anything of that sort. The historian deals with information. What the historian finds is it would be some kind of record that the commander of this battalion wrote to his commander that they came under heavy bombardment, they got afraid, they retreated and then regrouped. And maybe there's another source that one of the soldiers wrote a letter to his lover and wrote, oh, we came under heavy bombardment, I survived, but we retreated and regrouped. What's the best explanation of these two sources? What's the origin? Well, they came under heavy bombardment, got afraid, and retreated. Psychology is simply redundant, unnecessary. And I think this is the way that historians and historical scientists in general typically infer causation without reference to theories, without reference to covering laws or anything of that sort. What they do is they're information scientists. And as information scientists, they infer origins. And origins can be cause and effect sequences. You don't need metaphysically redundant covering laws or theories. Even if they exist, they're simply redundant in order to justify what you want to justify. So I'm just summing up the differences between causation and origination. These are all things that I've already said, and I'm running out of time. This summarizes the different ways that they are inferred, causes from origins. I'll get back to that. I'll leave this slide in a second. The conclusion: historical sciences are primarily sciences origin. Origins can justify historical causation. Theoretical sciences are mostly about, well, theories and causes, and they're not about origins. So we end up, to go back to the old debates in the philosophy of historiography. Back in the 19th century, neo-Kantians were trying to divide sciences like this and sciences are like that, historical sciences versus nomological sciences. Then the positivists picked up, without giving footnotes to the neo-Kantians, the same distinction. The humanists tried to base the distinction between the sciences on whether they had a human subject matter. That's why we have the faculties of humanities. And natural sciences, whether it is the subject matter is natural science. What I argue is the distinction should be different. It should be distinction between what we infer. Do we infer primarily origins, or do we infer primarily theories? If we infer origins and just as a signal, or whether we're dealing with a historical science that deals with origins, if scientists draw tree diagrams of transmission of information from origin to the present, whether it is in cosmology, phylogeny, archaeology, philology, textual criticism, this is a historical science of origins. No trees, it's probably theoretical. And that's it. Thank you.
Check online. Yes. Okay. Thanks. This was also very fitting for our rationale. The institutional rationale is very interdisciplinary, and that's the focus what we're doing at Eudaimonia. Anyway, there's ample time for comments and discussions, and we alternate between online audience and not online audience, but what audience is that? If anyone has any questions, comments in mind, just notify me. Is there anybody online?
There's somebody online, yes,
There
but
is?
I need to sort of wait. I muted them before.
Okay.
Okay, I think David, please.
If
Yes,
there's someone, then we can go first.
you can go now.
Hi, Avi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi, David.
So, I'm still thinking about question. I think you can easily avoid it, but in general, I like this approach. I think it's very provocative and elegant at the same way, at the same time. But I'm still thinking, you are trying to avoid, you're basically saying that to know the past, to have some knowledge of the past, we need to understand it as originary science, and we do not need much theoretical framework to know the origins. Like in general, you agree that we need to decipher the information, to decode the information from the origin. For example, in evolutionary biology, or even in the case of comparative linguistics, we need some theories or general theories, or the law-like regularities are in play there. So, in general, philosophers, when they are discussing these sciences, they leave it up for the biologists to decide what is the best way how to decode the information from the DNA. But at the same time, we philosophers, we often like to write about our own histories. We like to write intellectual history. This is a job for philosophers. And so I'm still thinking, do we also need some theories to decode information in in a history of philosophy or intellectual history? Because it seems to me, yeah, we can rely on folk psychology, we can rely on reading, and it can be very I believe you would say that we need no complex theory, like in the case of evolutionary biologists, to interpret or to decode the signal from the past of philosophy. But isn't it maybe perhaps misleading? Isn't there some hidden traps in applying folk psychology or some direct reading and very basic approach to interpretation there? If you understand my question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. In my opinion, there's a whole continuum in the historical sciences between inferences that are highly theoretical, that are totally impossible without a background scientific theory, but it's always about information. Theory is always about information, and inferences that require no information at all. And then in between there can be folk theoretical or rudimentary theoretical assumptions and so on and so forth. So, for example, inference of the Big Bang is entirely founded on theory. Without theory about background radiation and redshift and so on, it would be, and indeed it was, impossible to infer the Big Bang. You must have a theory. In philology and Darwinian biology, the theory is totally rudimentary or sort of maybe even borderline theory, because what Darwin assumed was like begets like. That's the basic assumption, that chicken tend to beget chicken and doves tend to beget doves. Okay, you can call it a theory, but obviously human beings have known that since the beginning of domestication of animals. They always saw that animals beget other animals. Is that how much of that is a theory? In the same way, in philology, if you hear the similarities between words, it's true that before they came out with the rudimentary theory of what to look at, there were a lot of etymological inferences that were nonsensical, because linguists based their inferences of etymologies simply on similarities between sounds. And then they came out with very strange things, because the probability that languages, given the limits of the human larynx, would come up with similar sounds are very high, even if there's no historical context. Only in the late 18th century, they came up with theories, but again, these were theories that were very rudimentary and could have been observed anytime through history, long before the invention of science. So if you just think about names of places in your immediate environment, you can see that they tend to preserve information much earlier, much older information than words that are words of politeness and trade. I don't know much about Finnish, but in the United States, you see that names of many places preserve their Indian original Native American name, much more than any other part of the English language. Because names of places mutate very slowly. They mutate, but they mutate very slowly. And if you think about other languages, you see that Celtic names in England or in Ireland, they tend it tends to be preserved much better. Then if you compare languages that you know, you see that the first few numbers, the immediate family members, mother, father, and so on, they also tend to be more similar because they preserve more information, they mutate more slowly than other parts. And obviously to generate a new grammar, takes much longer. So that's a kind of theory, but it's kind of a generalization that people could have come up, at any time. Then when it comes to inferences in intellectual history, what's the theory would be how sophisticated that is. Would that evolve independently? So when an intellectual development has an obvious utility, it can evolve independently. For example, why are there pyramids in Babylon, in ancient Egypt, and in Latin America or South America? Well, it's functional. Before people invented columns, the only way you could build a building and it wouldn't fall is if it had the shape of a pyramid, so that the foundation holds. You don't need spaceships on Eric von Däniken and connection between those two cultures. Simply, it's determined by the rules of the universe. They could try any structure before they invented columns and arches. It would fall unless it was a pyramid. That's it. the invention of the will, the invention of the domestication of animals. These are all functional inventions that would have been invented even without any context. But when it comes to cultural things that have no obvious function, that have no adaptive advantage, how would they come up with it? You know, how would Sartre come with all these ideas about being if he had not read Heidegger? And I'm not thinking or not mentioning here footnotes. All these inferences that we make in intellectual history, in history of ideas, are about intellectual trends that are not functional, or about ideas that are not functional. Is there a theory there? You ask yourself, would they have developed the will independently? You would say, well, yeah, the will is fairly useful. Is that a theory? Or if you say this kind of intellectual school doesn't have great function, or it's highly unlikely to develop independently. That is, if you read a translation of Plato to a distant language, let's say language in the Indian subcontinent, either they got it from Plato, either it is a translation of Plato, or somebody reinvented Plato independently. How likely is that somebody would come up with something so similar to Plato without actually translating Plato? Do you need a theory for that? Probably not. That's more common sense. But it depends on what you mean exactly by theory. That's why I say there's probably a continuum there between cases that are obviously theoretical, like background radiation, like contemporary phylogeny, which is of course based on a theory of genetics. Without that, you wouldn't know that this piece of human genome actually doesn't belong to humans. It came from insects. That you need the theory. Two, sort of something so commonsensical, statistical generalization, something that obviously existed long before human beings invented science, long before the 17th century. So you would say that no, that's probably not very theoretical. But it's a continuum. It's not like black and white, yes, no, bivalent distinction.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, is there something?
There's more online, but take first.
Yes, Petteri.
Inspiring. How do you get also communism? Can you hear me?
Oh, can the online audience?
Can online hear him?
Probably not.
Could you hear him?
Not so much, but
Maybe you can come down a bit, or at least stand up.
I'm giving a lecture course on history of communism, and I will discuss in my next class the assassin of Trotsky. And we all know the cause of his death. He was murdered by a Spanish Bolshevik with an ice pick. That's the cause of immediate cause of his death. But I would like to ask you whether you would, because I'm not sure about the differentiation between origin and cause. So if I say to my students, for example, that the immediate cause of Trotsky's death was the assassination done by the Spanish Bolshevik, but the origin of Trotsky's death is the Russian Revolution, because the Russian Revolution was sort of the political basis of everything that has happened in Soviet Russia after that, including the fight for power between Trotsky and Stalin and so forth. So is it possible to understand origin as a basis or foundation that
I think what you mean is a deep cause or original cause. But when I think about origins in the historical sciences, say, how do we know that Trotsky was murdered, as you described, by a Spanish Bolshevik with an ice pick? Well, the problem is most people think that this is a fact. You know, we observe that and then we try to explain it. Same way that I would observe here this object and I drop it and it falls. But no, it's not observable at all. See, in principle, it's entirely unobservable. They may confuse it with a movie, where I think
Yes.
Richard Burton played Trotsky. Or,
That's right.
yeah,
And,
and I think, you know, the same way that I watch it in the movie, and this is like, that's what happened.
Yeah.
Whereas, in fact, the movie is based on a chain of information transmission. So what we do, what do historians really do? If you want to write, I mean, if you teach the murder of Trotsky, then you just use a text. But if you want to write an article, you want to re-examine this episode, what would you do? Well, you would go to Mexico City, and you would go to the archives of the Mexican police, and you would read the accounts that the Mexican police made when they were invited to the scene of the crime, presumably, and they collected evidence from people who observed that this journalist who interviewed Trotsky and showed him some of his article, and he came and then came again, and so on. And perhaps there would be some text by Mrs. Trotsky, who also recorded what happened. And then what the historians would do say, okay, here are all these information signals. Some of them were lost. Maybe there were people who were there who were not interviewed or did not leave their own accounts. That was lost. What do we have is these information signals. And then what you would look is how similar they are now different. So if you have two eyewitnesses who saw the same thing and they agree, then what is the probability that they would agree and this never happened? What's the probability that Trotsky was murdered in some other way, rather than this bizarre way of, you know, using an ice? Very low. So probably they agree. Then you find some disagreement. Then we're like, okay, why did they disagree? Could it be that somebody had a bad memory, were standing in the wrong place, or you may decide, actually, I don't have a good information signal here. I just don't know. Could have happened this way, could have happened that way. It's underdetermined. And I would argue when historians talk about origins, that's the historical event. And what they're interested here is not the effects, but the information signal that got to the present. Right. Where does the deep course that you mentioned earlier? What you would say is that why was Trotsky important? Why did Stalin bother to order to murder him? Why was this way? Is this how they settled the scores within the leadership in the democratic countries? We don't murder our opponents. And then you would say, okay, here are all the information signals, and then you get many, many more about the kind of regime that Lenin created. You can see that they had no mechanism for resolving disputes without violence at that stage. And then you would say, there are other cases where Stalin had to kill Zinoviev, Stalin had to kill Kamenev.
Numerous polls. Almost everyone was.
Exactly, with the exception of Lenin and Stalin, all the founders of Bolshevism were killed.
If they did not die naturally before. If they did not die naturally before the purchase.
They were not lucky enough to
some of them died.
They became interesting to the leader. The only one who died in bed was Stalin. And then you would say, okay, so these are all the information signals I had about how they resolved the dispute. It fits also this information signal about Trotsky, so it all fits into this larger scheme of things.
Right.
And then a historian will say, when do the information signals change? When there's and then Jouni wrote in his book, Post-Narrativism, he talks about the colligation of the concept of thought in Soviet Russia. Now, within this context, what the thought would mean is when do people lose their position in the leadership, but keep their life? They go in exile, they are demoted, but they are not killed, and their families are not hurt. That's when Khrushchev, 1956, roughly. The Congress, the denunciation of Stalin, the end of Stalinism, then eventually Khrushchev loses his position, but he keeps his life. And then his grandson immigrates to America, becomes a professor in Brown University, and his daughter, Nina, was my colleague, great-granddaughter of Khrushchev, Nina Khrushchev. And then you know that you colligate already something else. Now, what's the colligation? is your colligation means there are consistent information signals. Nobody gets killed anymore, or earlier everybody gets killed. So what you colligate from that, what you get is you have an agreement between all these information signals. The way to resolve political issues in this regime is by murdering your opponent. The way of resolving political issues in this late communist regime is by demoting your opponent. You don't need to kill him. And you have this kind of gentlemanly agreement already, because everybody knows they're going to lose power at one point or another. There's this gentlemanly agreement between them. We don't kill each other anymore.
Yes, and you call historians information scientists.
Yes.
Nice.
What they deal with is information signal. They don't deal with Khrushchev or Stalin. They are dead. They will never meet them. The train always left the station before the historian arrives. Historian only looks at the train as it departing the station. And the wisdom, I mean, if you want to study the death of Trotsky, go to the archive. You don't meet Trotsky. And you never will. You have to go to get an information to collect all the relevant, try to collect all the relevant information signals for what you think. And what makes you a great historian is that you discover an information signal that either was unknown, find somebody's diaries, you look at some archives that nobody looked before, yes. Or you look at information that was available, has been available for a very long time, but you find a new way of extracting information. So, for example, if you ask yourself a question about the standard of living of the British working classes in the 19th century, the data about the sales of meat in a working class meat market has been available forever. It was never seen. But you need a historian to think, one of the first things that working class people would do when they have a bit more money is they would buy more meat, eat more meat. It's more expensive. Let's look at these statistics for how the meat sales. And then obviously when they get even wealthier, then they care about health, then they buy less meat. So you look at these statistics and you discover something. You discover a signal that was there, but other people didn't look.
And Engels wrote about the condition of the working class in England, especially in Manchester. I already talked about it to my students.
Correct.
They were
or if you want to learn about what was the world view of illiterate people in the Middle Ages, then it takes wisdom to look at the records of the Inquisition. So actually they preserve information about the religion of people who were illiterate, couldn't write. And then you discover all this kind of complex paganism that persisted in Europe in the Middle Ages.
Indeed, also in Finland.
Thank
you very much.
Next question online.
Two comments on that still.
Maybe
some more here.
I think go one by one, maybe.
Yes.
And remember the coffee and that snacks.
So there's a comment by Nick Nielsen. There we go. The audience. There seems to be a strong epistemic relationship between causal mechanism and origins. When Alfred Wegener posited continental origins to a continental drift, but without a causal mechanism, it was widely rejected. It was not accepted until the mid-Atlantic oceanic ridge was mapped by submarines. It was the causal mechanism that was persuasive to geology. Here, causes appear to play a more prominent role than origins. Both Wegener and the submarine mapping transmitted information. Are these different kinds of information or the same kind of information?
Can you go back to my slides? So, what? Yeah. Okay. What we can see here is this is the map of Pangea, this ancient continent. Now, obviously, this sort of butt of Brazil fitting West Africa, that's something that was pretty visible since human beings drew maps. And then you can see all this nice fitting of this of the shapes of the continents. And that's something that gave the basic idea about continental drift. What was missing indeed was the continental drift. But the inference of the common origin is independent of the common drift, just because how implausible is it that that Brazil would be independently like this if it was not a single continent. What was missing is how do we know, how does this mechanism work? And the same thing is true for Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin did not have a mechanism for why like begets like. Just see it, like begets like, but he had no genetics. Now it's true that before this synthesis between genetics and natural selection, theory of evolution was not complete, it was not as persuasive, but the simple inference of the origin, part of the mechanism. I mean, I could imagine why Brazil would fit Africa without continental drift. Maybe there was some explosion that would tear the continents apart without knowing anything about plates and continental drift and so on. But the inference of the origin, rather than the mechanism, rather than the plates, for that, the causal mechanism was redundant, the same way that Darwin's inference of common origin of species did not rely on any known causal mechanism. So I would argue you can infer origins without causal mechanisms, although sure, when you have the causal mechanism, it explains it better why it happened, and you get a more complete theory. And then historical scientists would be better convinced of that. I mean, creationism, of course, still exists, despite the fact that there's the theory, there's the mechanism, there's the inference of origin. But it takes a lot to convince some people, and some people are just dogmatic. I mean, until today, there are theories of causation that say causation must be based on mechanism. Without mechanism, there's no causation, even though there's statistical, stochastic processes, and so on and so forth. So there's some kind of mechanistic fetishism, I would even say, more so in philosophy than in science these days, because there's so many statistical probabilistic sciences, from quantum physics all the way up.
Okay, is there any questions here? I have one. Oh, just I will have a few clarifications, but I will actually, in the interest of time, to go my biggest interest and question. That is, I'm curious about the stages of the origination approach on the whole in the framework of history writing and historiography. And I suggest to you, and then I give some grounds for this. Is this kind of a minimal or perhaps a sufficient requirement for history writing, but far from being sufficient? And I'm saying that because if you look at how history is written, how does it look? Or even in biology, how the research, the outcomes, how they look. They are not anything like trees of life or evolutionary trees. So maybe you need to trace that. But then if you look at the writing, it has a lot of all kinds of signification, let's say, from the side of the historian or historian's culture, or need to take into account the intentionality of the agents, and so on and so forth. Maybe you have these narrative linguistic structures. So origin is maybe just you and Goldstein have used the understructure, and then the superstructure brings a lot of that is not insignificant for cognitively speaking, epistemologically speaking. So it's a significant addition. So that's my question. What's the status?
Indeed, as you say, superstructure, for me and Goldstein, we don't deny that there is a superstructure. We don't deny that there are many narratives, both in biology and in historiography, but these are popularizations. So in biology, it's obvious the last person who was a great scientist and a great writer was Darwin. The Origin of Species is the last purely scientific book that was also bestseller and read by everybody else. Since then, there's bifraction. In historiography, it's less obvious, but to be appreciated by other historians, you don't write a bestseller. You discover something in the art. You do something in the substract. What I would concede, though, is that both narrative and colligation are capable of generating new knowledge which goes beyond the originary input. Let me explain what I mean. If you read the text in an archive, and it's a reliable text and credible source, say a document from the Foreign Office about a certain meeting. If this is a reliable source, what it does is it transmits information. And by transmit, I mean that the most that you know as a historian is what is the information that it is in this text. You don't know more. Don't generate more. And what narrative and colligation can do is they generate more knowledge than is being transmitted through the structure of narrative and through the structure of colligation. For example, suppose that you have a transmission of knowledge that Caesar fought a battle in a certain village in Gaul, and then a week later he fought another battle in another village in Gaul. Now, once you tell it as a narrative, there's obviously something happened during that week. Obviously, Caesar marched during that week from that place to another place. You look in the map, you'll see what is the distance. You will infer then how fast was Caesar going, or whether he was resting for a while between two battles. You look for other sources. What were the norms of the Roman legions? Did they move quickly from one battle to another, or did they rest, nurse their wounds after one battle? And you will tell a whole story there that is not there in the transmitted information. But by structuring it in the form of narrative, you can generate new information. The same thing with colligation. If you say Trotsky was murdered, Kamenev was murdered, Zinoviev was murdered, and so on and so forth, and then you would colligate from that it was a murderous regime. That the only way that political disputes were handled, power disputes were handled, was through elimination, through killing. You would colligate that. Then when they stopped, you would colligate there's a thought. They stopped killing each other. And that would generate more information than just saying Kamenev was murdered, Zinoviev. You would generate more information. And that is certainly there, but it is generated from inputs, from transmitted information that comes from origins. And then arguably, once you generate this new information, you're generating information about those origins, which was not in the signal that you received. You generate new information.
Would it be fair to say, very briefly, or maybe even yes or no answer, whatever is found on the level of superstructure, the textual level, either has to be reductive to the origins, or has to go away, or should go away?
No, it doesn't need to go away. I mean, I have no problem somebody writing a history book and saying that Hitler was a monster. It's just that is a value judgment. It's not based solely on the origin. He added something. You can say something was pretty, something, that ancient Greek buildings were beautiful. I don't have any problem with that. Popular books of historiography do not have to be entirely reduced to influences from origins. There's no need. But what I would argue is that the historical science is inferring origins. Historians don't have to be exclusively historians, and they can go on being human beings. The historian can make value judgment, can add, can beautify. That's the point about a superstructure. You build a building. The building has to be solid. There has to be foundation. Then you want to add a column. You want to, it's a matter of taste. I may have a modernist taste, and I want my buildings, straight and no adoration, Bauhaus. You may like it more Baroque. Okay, there's no fact of the matter. Chacun son goût,
Yes. Okay. I suggest we take two more questions, one online and Georg.
Yeah.
Willy had some.
But there's Willy online.
Something.
So this question is for Willy left. And he's followed by the potato.
Wonderful, yes.
If I got its purpose right, it is supposed to show that knowing the causal story is irrelevant for knowing that the Polynesian potato originates in South America. But it seems to me that being in the position to know this is entirely dependent on simply knowing how causes work. Simply by knowing that potato comes from South America, we can infer that any potato we encounter anywhere ultimately comes to South America. That's not an explanation. What would be an interesting historical explanation would be to give an account in terms of causes of how potato came to the East.
Right. So first, I want to say something about potatoes. If you come from Central Europe, I think also in Finland, potato is the most unpolitical thing you can think of. And I like that because you have all these narrativist or ideological and so on interpretation of historiography that it's all reducible to power structure, interest, ideologies, literature. And I said, well, let's talk about potato. It's the most unpolitical, unideological thing I can think of, and yet extremely important. Without the importation of potatoes to Europe in the 17th century, we wouldn't have modernity. Potatoes allowed the huge demographic growth and so on. That is incredibly important. Because also, a farmer can subsist entirely on potato. It's not very rich in vitamins, but it gives you just enough. So potatoes are extremely important and non-political. Now, we have the knowledge that the origin of the Polynesian potato was in South America is an originary knowledge, because we don't know what was the mechanism. We don't know what the causal chain of events. We just know where it started, in South America. We know where it ended in Polynesia. Is there an interesting story to tell them? I'm sure there is. I mean, the fascinating story. How some native to America got on boats and somehow ended up in Polynesia, who they met, did. Fascinating. All backwards with the Polynesians, it's even more interesting because it's not just that they would have had to get to South America, which is not implausible given that they made it to New Zealand, but that they would have had to find their way back to Polynesia with potatoes, right? Which is much more difficult to imagine. How they had no compass, they had no knowledge of streams. How did they find their way back home? That's almost Steven Spielberg movie. Fascinating, but totally underdetermined because we have no knowledge. There's no evidence. There's no signal that tells us what was the cause mechanism that was involved. Surely the transmission of the information is supervening on some sort of causal mechanism. It's not. There's no magic. There's no. An example for magic in information transmission without causation can only come from implausible science fiction. For example, if you all know the movie 2001: Space Odyssey, the astronaut is transmitted across the universe and finds himself in a French Baroque room. Why French Baroque? Because somehow the information from the French Baroque reached those aliens, and they rebuild it somewhere in who knows where, in outer space. Now, for that to be transmitted, you have to break the laws of physics because it's supraluminal transmission of information that is transmitted faster than the speed of light. That's impossible. But as a thought experiment, you can imagine yourself, if you find yourself in such a room, the probability that aliens would develop the French Baroque without a French Baroque origin is negligible. And then there is no causal mechanism. But in the case of the Polynesian potato, there is some causal mechanism. And our knowledge that the origin was in South America supervenes on the assumption such a causal mechanism. But epistemically, not metaphysically, epistemically, just no foundation for discriminating between an infinite number of theories of how this transmission will happen. Could have been birds, could have been streams in the sea, could have been a storm. Who knows?
Final question.
No, I have a question. The short question is similar to what Jouni-Matti asked before. Should historians mend their ways given your field? What I mean by that is, you said something like, for example, psychology is redundant, social science theories are redundant. Maybe also fashionable philosophy is redundant. There's a lot of historians, there's cultural history, then historians start to talk about the linguistic term. These are not information theories. And presumably, a lot of historians are not good philosophers, and they might not be so good theorists either. So the way we discuss these things are
not that elaborate either. So there's a German proverb, shoemakers stick to your shoes. Should historians, because obviously he also shackles on group, they discuss that stuff, and it's good for them as long as they do the other important stuff correct. Or
Yeah, no, I think mainstream historians, and you have marginal historians who are really too influenced by misinterpreting this and that. But mainstream historians should just keep doing what they're doing quite well. They don't need to understand what they're doing. I'm offering them a way of understanding it. You know, an effective dolphin does not need to know hydrodynamics. And hydrodynamic engineer does not have to know how to swim, let alone be a dolphin. The division of labor is that historians should do what they do well, and philosophers of historiography should understand the testimonies of what historians are saying about what they're doing, look at the actual process of inference from origins, which is traceable through footnotes, and then they can theorize that, explain that, and historians can read it. Maybe they understand it, maybe they don't, and maybe it doesn't matter if they understand it or not. The dolphin does not have to read text in hydrodynamics to be an effective dolphin. But engineers can observe what dolphins do and construct hydrodynamic boats and submarines based on what they study from dolphins.
Great. I think we end here. Many thanks for coming. Many thanks, Avi. Let's thank
you to the audience online as well. And to the historical audience, it's going to be online, so people will read this and receive this information signal from this
find the origin of some new ideas.
Yeah.
Millions of years.
Millions of years.
Yeah. Thank you.